In order to articulate a response to the selected driving questions, a video inspired by BBC documentary was adapted with minor editing to include definition of key terms and concepts. References are from Welch et al., Saunders, Rahman, and Nakata. Who are the Indigenous Australians? When searched up from the Oxford Dictionary, it defines the word Aboriginal as inhabiting or existing in a land from the earliest of times or from before the arrival of the colonists, in Australia, the British, who then coined the word Indigenous, meaning the Aboriginal inhabitant of the place. This definition, however, is given and could be referring to any of the first inhabitants of any landmass on Earth. They could be Native American, Chinese, Indians, African, etc. In Canada, Aboriginal group refers to whether the person is First Nations or the North American Indian, Métis, or Inuit. These are the groups defined as Aboriginal peoples of Canada in the Constitution Act 1982, Section 35. In the States, Aboriginal used to describe any group of people native to a specific region. In other words, it refers to people who lived there before colonists or settlers arrived and defined new borders and began to occupy the land.
The Aborigines were deemed to be subhuman, little more than animals, which was to justify not only the theft of their land, but their extermination. An edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica described them as only an animal of prey, more ferocious than the leopard or the hyena. He devours his own species. Few doubted at the time that genocide was official policy. A government report in the 1850s spoke of the success of poisoning Aborigines, 100 of them laid out at a time. But until quite recently, little of this was even acknowledged. In Tasmania, the Aborigines were said to have died out. In fact, they were hunted along with kangaroos and almost wiped out.
Whilst concepts of indigeneity vary from country to country, their fate is very similar. Mass murder in the name of civilization and colonization. Aborigine, which was once an acceptable word in the past, is now an offensive word as it connotates inferiority. To answer the next topic question, can it be true that racial discrimination and negative views of minority groups are often a product of our upbringing and personal cultural background? If so, how could we as future teachers challenge our students' beliefs in our own disposition without causing conflict? Collectively, we say that we can challenge students' beliefs in our own without causing family conflict if we are conscious of the inherent barriers. Barriers from our co-educators' perspective, the parents' and the guardians' concerns, the program structure, supervision of all children and the problems of other children occurring, child-specific barriers, or just the physical environment itself. By being aware of these barriers, we get a better understanding that the discourse is caused by dissonance and conditioning, which serves as the key foundation of our prejudice and biases. So as teachers, we need to ensure that we don't impose our traditions as whether we do not mean it or if we are deliberate. To the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, they feel the same. They will feel humiliated, ridiculed, and excluded as unequal members of the school. So our responsibility to the profession calls to abolish this cycle of suffering, and together it can be 100% preventable. By also engaging into reflexive questioning and utilizing a backward mapping discussion technique where we as teachers plan our lessons with the end goal in mind, to educate all children and remembering that they all learn differently. Through this, we can then work on developing meaningful scaffolds and learning plans that are relatable to all students, and we can individualize adjustments necessary to improve students' understanding and engagement is more likely. Teaching strategies will be discussed by Jen later on. I will now touch on our key terms and concepts whilst also answering discussion questions. Our answer to question number 3 about retention rates of Indigenous students in a school. It is fully dependent on leadership or the principal and must be mandated from top to bottom. See, Aboriginal students only gained the right to a Year 12 education only 40 years ago because they were deliberately excluded by our government. Therefore, we define exclusion as a conscious and unconscious act of preventing a person or any group from fully participating in all aspects of school and community life. We will, however, continuously work with the willing and be conscious of Indigenous knowledge by moving away from the traditional banking of education that alienates Australia's First Peoples' fundamental language and way of education that was stereotyped as informal. We define Indigenous education, for example, the Yarning Circle, as a practical demonstration and confirmation of learning is deemed achieved through a real-life proof of capability rather than the academic performance in contrived settings. Indigenous knowledge also incorporates processes and divisions of knowledge that required younger generation to master an intricate layer of story song done via oral communication, which was predominantly the way to demonstrate learning. Moving to question number 4. As pre-service teachers, we can contribute to reconciliation movement whilst teaching our KLAs by planning lessons that can be differentiated and by being vigilant of our bias and attitude to shape our actions beyond NIDOC week. This is where post-colonialism comes in, where it is concerned with the ongoing effects and impact of colonial imperialism. So we will then try our best to abolish the unequal power relations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and aim to decolonize the way of educating them in both symbolic and material effects. And in order for our actions to be critically conscious, our advocacy must be implicit, continuous, and free of bigotry across the entire school program. Our answer to question number 5. We plan to develop our pedagogical approach in educating our students about diversity, for example, Indigenous issues, by working on abolishing a barrier at a time. We hope we are able to take on the biggest obstacle to emancipation of schooling and abolish any form of segregation or withdrawals by moving away from a fixed medium of presentation and assessment and learning. We ought to make lesson plans that are accessible to all through flipped classrooms and allowing for assistive technologies and individualization at all times.